In Sao Paulo, there is a highway that has been under construction for 40 years and 300 billion reais. It is not finished, not because the money ran out, not because of a war, because Brazil keeps doing this to itself. Your electricity bill is higher than it should be. Your phone contract, the price of food this month. You already know this. What you probably do not know is that every price connects to one number you have never been told about. Brazil's benchmark interest rate set at 15% for most of 2025, not during a recession, not during a war, 15% in what the government officially describes as normal operating conditions, among the highest rates on the planet. The strange part is Brazil is not collapsing. The economy grew 2.2% in 2025. Jobs were created. 3 million new formal jobs were created in 2024. Unemployment fell to a record low of 6.2%. By every measure Brazil publishes, the country is doing reasonably well. That is exactly what makes this so hard to explain. Because the surface numbers look fine, and the country is still getting further from prosperity every single year. We covered Germany last month. That was a giant running out of the world it was built for. This is something different. Brazil is a giant that never fully arrived. The reason it never arrived has been sitting in plain sight for 60 years. In the 12 months to April 2026, Brazil paid 8.43% of gross domestic product in interest alone. That is not a percentage of revenue, that is a percentage of everything the entire country produces in a year, gone. According to the International Monetary Fund database, Brazil held the highest interest burden of any major economy on earth, higher than Sri Lanka, higher than Pakistan, higher than every G20 member, in normal times, not a crisis, normal. Add the primary deficit, and the total nominal hole in Brazil's budget reached 9.41% of gross domestic product. The economy grows at 2.2. The hole in the budget is 9.4. Every year the country borrows the difference. That is not a rough patch. That is not mismanagement. That is a structural design locked into how the state was built. Gross public debt reached 79.2% of gross domestic product in February 2026. It is rising every month. Debt is projected to reach 90% of gross domestic product by 2027. That is before any election year stimulus begins. Every election cycle the spending increases. Every increase widens the deficit. Every wider deficit raises the debt. Without fail, new story every week. Subscribe only if you want the uncomfortable version of what is actually happening in the world. The rate stays high to fight inflation. The debt costs more is borrowed. The cycle has no natural exit point. Here is the mechanism underneath all of this. Understand it once and you will see it everywhere, not only in Brazil. High interest rates choke private investment. Without new investment, factories stay old. Old factories produce significantly less per worker. Less per worker means lower productivity. Lower productivity means the economy cannot grow fast enough to outrun the debt, so the debt grows faster than the economy. So the interest bill grows larger, so the rate stays high. Perfect circle. Between 2002 and 2014, Brazil's total factor productivity grew at just 0.3% per year on average. 0.3% per year. Not during a recession, during the commodity boom. The fastest growth decade Brazil had ever seen. China was buying everything Brazil dug up. Prices were high, money was flowing, and productivity was barely moving. Brazil mistook the buyer for a strategy. When China slowed its buying, there was no strategy left. Only the debt remained. Brazil did not fail to grow. It grew and built a machine that consumes every gain before anyone can spend it. Agriculture works. Deep-sea oil works. Aircraft manufacturing works. Those sectors did everything right. The frame was wrong. The frame is the fiscal architecture, constitutional spending rules, the interest structure, things surrounding every good decision and cancelling it. A crumbling federal road in Goiás state, potholes every 3 meters. trucks losing tires before they reach the port. Port logistics cost Brazil more per kilogram than anywhere in South America. The harvest is world-class. The road to port is not. The productivity gain is eaten by the logistics cost before the product leaves the country. Infrastructure investment has not kept pace. The World Bank has a name for this: the middle income trap. Brazil has been inside it for 62 years without leaving, since 1960, trapped in the same position, not poor enough to compete on cheap labor, not rich enough to lead on innovation, wages too high to undercut Vietnam on price, productivity too low to match Germany on quality, caught exactly between both, permanently. Since 1960, 23 economies escaped the middle income trap: South Korea, Singapore, Holland, Ireland. Brazil was not among them, not because Brazil is badly run, because the trap has a specific mechanism and Brazil activated every part of it simultaneously. The budget is constitutionally rigid. 80% of government spending is locked by law. It cannot be touched without a supermajority. Pension obligations, social transfer payment floors, civil service salaries indexed automatically to inflation from the moment it begins. Inflation rises, mandatory spending rises automatically with it, the deficit widens, the central bank raises the rate to fight inflation. Higher rate, more interest on the debt, wider deficit, more borrowing, inflation stays elevated, rate stays high, full circle. I expected a country poorly managed. What the data shows is a country precisely trapped, a different problem entirely. Managing it better would help at the margins, but the trap is not a management problem. It is an architecture problem entirely. Better management of the wrong architecture does not change the architecture. You still need to fix the foundation eventually. That is what is so difficult about watching Brazil from the outside. Every individual decision is rational. The system is not. A pension that protects a retiree is rational. An interest rate that fights inflation is rational. Together they consume the future. Here is what is already gone. Brazil's gross domestic product in US dollar terms has not recovered its 2014 peak. That peak was 2.46 trillion US dollars. Over a decade later, in dollar terms, Brazil still has not returned to it. The real depreciated. The domestic numbers look fine in reais, measured against the world. A decade of wealth simply left. The generation that grew up during the commodity boom watched their purchasing power leave quietly while salaries held flat. Brazil has more nursing homes than technical schools in most interior states. That is not a metaphor. It is a budget line. Infrastructure investment held at bare minimum maintenance levels for 3 decades straight, not underinvestment, decades of deliberate stagnation. A school in the interior of Piauí, 40 students, 3 teachers, 1 functional toilet. This is not poverty. This is policy. Public sector employment grew 3.9% last year. Private sector grew too, but only one of them is fiscally sustainable. Every public sector hire is a future pension obligation. Every pension obligation is a future interest cost. The chain never ends. The harvest is world-class. Embraer builds aircraft that compete with Boeing. Petrobras drills in water 2 miles deep, and yet the country that drills 2 miles beneath the Atlantic cannot finish a highway 40 years into construction. That is the most honest summary of Brazil's condition. Not failing across the board, brilliant in pockets, structurally paralyzed everywhere else. That is what is already gone, not a future risk, not a projection. The divergence between potential and reality already happened. Back to the highway in Sao Paulo, the one 40 years in construction, the one that is still not finished this morning. Every government since 1980 has promised it would be completed. Everyone found the money already allocated elsewhere. The trap is structural. It does not care which party wins the 2026 election. The arithmetic does not change with the flag. A deal changes the ceiling, not the floor. Brazil has been finding new ceilings for 60 years. The floor always held firm. The floor is productivity reform, infrastructure investment, the willingness to rewrite constitutional spending rules nobody wants to touch. In 2025, after 20 years of debate, Brazil passed a major consumption tax reform, a real structural change. Multiple state and federal taxes consolidated into a single system, compliance costs cut. 20 years of debate resolved in one vote. It is the right reform. It is 20 years late, and it will take another decade to fully flow through the economy. While that decade passes, the interest machine will cost Brazil more than 1 trillion reais every single year in servicing alone. The reform plants the seed. The debt eats the harvest before it grows. That has been Brazil's condition for 62 years. The question is not whether Brazil can grow. It already knows how. It has always known. That was never the problem here. The question is whether it can grow faster than the machine consuming the growth. That race has been running since 1960. Brazil is not dying. It is not collapsing. It is waiting. Patient in a way only 200 million people can manage. The fracture was always there, built into the constitution, priced into the interest rate, present before the first brick was laid. The construction worker still on his beam, the city still below, the rebar still exposed. He is still waiting for the floor.